Hey Svitlana,
Hello, Arne.
time for some smart moves. I am looking very forward to this. I thought so, but then I saw loads of pawns. And this is actually really interesting. And once again, I'm so happy that I have you in my life to teach me the good stuff because this is definitely a position which you see all the time, and I would have no approach to how to play it in the best way. And probably
Okay,
you can teach
so
us.
we're not looking at this particular position, so
Okay.
it's not going to be an end game. But you're right. This you already recognized it that it's a position with an isolated queen pawn, and that's a very important pawn structure in chess because you get it from a variety of openings. You have it in the Queen's Gambit accepted, the Slav, the Taraj defense, the Alapin. Karakhan Panov also it can arise. It can arise from many different things,
Loads, yeah.
and there are some pawn structures where you can have a specific approach or at least an idea of what is the right way to play in them. So, do you are you kind of familiar with these positions? Do you play any of the openings that I've said, and which side? So you don't get these from either side.
Wap, 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 wah. No, I don't get these from either side at all. I mean, yeah, normally I play against an isolated pawn sometimes. That might be the maximum. But then
Mhm.
again, normally all my pawns are sacrificed anyway, and then there's no structure.
Yeah, for you, they're not weak pawns; they're just gone.
Yes, exactly. Gone pawns. Gone pawns.
Yeah. So this particular position, like I said, it can come from many openings, but sometimes if your repertoire is really not like in the normal realm, then it's possible that you don't get them.
It's
You
nice how
don't
you
get them that
described it.
often. But an isolated queen pawn, you're still, even if you don't play any of these openings, it's gonna arise at some point,
Yeah.
and the plans can still be similar. So um, basically, is there any sort of piece configuration that you know as like White's plans?
No.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. Then we'll get to it. And for black, you might know a bit more because you said you do play against the isolated pawn.
Yeah, so but still I mean I'm playing against it and sometimes I win, sometimes I lose and I have no idea why. And sometimes
Hmm.
it's a draw, but that's more rarely the case. Most
Okay.
often I lose, I guess, because I'm just still bad in endgames.
Okay, so we can go over right now. I'll just say that some of the typical plans, and then we'll go to the example and try to apply them.
Okay.
So, as a side with the isolated pawn in a setup like this, the most standard plan would be try to create a kingside attack. So most of these plans include the moves like knight going to e5, the bishop going to g5, and also the queen and bishop battery on this diagonal. So usually this is the piece setup that you would try to go for. The rooks are typically go somewhere like e1 and, for example, d1 or c1.
Hmm.
So for the rooks, there can be some options. And this pawn also allows for a rook transfer sometimes on the third rank because white has a bit more space here. What is usually preferable for white is a pawn break in the center with the move d5 at the right time.
Hmm.
So if you could get rid of this pawn in a good way, so not for free and not for nothing, of course, but for some initiative or for some other factor, that is usually the pawn break that you look to. And trading pawns in these files is usually good because you end up as a side with the isolated pawn out of this openings, you end up having more development. And so if you can achieve this trade, it's usually good for you, but every situation depends. So
Okay.
that's why I said at the right time. um, so with black plans, it's try to trade pieces and win this in an end game. That's one of the main strategies you can follow. In particular, you want to exchange white's good bishop, so the white's light squared bishop. And normally, I'm not sure if you've heard this rule, but do you think you would rather play this endgame with major pieces or with minor pieces, so against the isolated pawn.
Against the isolated pawn. Now let me quickly put on my thinking hat. And before I do this, by the way, for you at home, just to let you know, if you watch this on YouTube and you haven't looked at the news site where we're posting the article for this video, of course, underneath the video you see a board. You should take this as a chance to engage with our training and replay the positions once it is done. Put in your own thoughts. You can download all your analysis. So that's what it is for. And yeah, this is what we are trying to teach to you. Now, I think it might be good to concentrate to have major pieces against an isolated pawn because they can build up a battery pretty easy. Yeah, that just
Right.
makes sense.
That's good. So if you can imagine, let's say the two rooks and the queens on this file, and white's rooks and queens here, it's you can right away tell that it's a very favorable endgame. And normally you do want to keep the major pieces as black. And the reason for that is that usually you can get a pawn break because of the pin on this file, and you end up winning the pawn. So this is why this is a very typical way to set up your major pieces and eventually win this pawn because of the pin on the d file.
Nice.
So
okay, yeah, that's a very good tip already. So yeah, I mean, I thought so, and probably my intuition was all about it, but then I
yeah, you might
really,
have heard it before too. So trading pieces generally a good thing, especially if you can get into that end game with only major pieces where you're purely attacking the pawn and the opponent is purely defending it. That is good. And the last tip, I think, for the side again who's playing against the isolated pawn is to place a knight onto d5. So trading pawns and like if once the pawns on the c and the e file have been traded, d5 becomes an outpost for the knight. So it's an ideal square. It prevents the central pawn break of d5 from white, and it controls a lot of the key squares. So the good place and the knight on d5 usually belongs there in these positions. Even in, let's say, endgames, even a knight or a bishop or a king would be really strong on those squares. So it's just an outpost that you can occupy with any piece. Out of the opening, probably the knight would be best. These positions, we're going to get to the example. These positions are usually very, very logical, and once you understand the plans, you see them implemented all over and over again in these positions by all of the players, because the plans are pretty straightforward. And yeah, but playing them can be tricky. It can get really tactical. So you would need to have good precision when you're calculating, especially the pawn breaks or all the tactics that are related to it, because these positions usually do get tactical. And it's the biggest question is to realize for yourself when this pawn is a strength and when it is a weakness.
Wow, okay. Let's see.
The first example I wanted to show, we're going to first be the side playing with the pawn, and then we're going to be the side playing against the pawn. So in this one, we're playing with the pawn, and I'll show how the game went. So it doesn't exactly matter how it started. It started being in English, then it went into a Caro-Kann, I guess.
Fairly odd.
And at the end, it transposed into Queen's Gambit accepted. At least that's what my little square is saying. So let's get to the position. This is the one that I wanted to get to. So we arrived at our pawn structure. Looking at it from White's perspective, where do you think the pieces would belong, and which move would you make?
Well, so, I mean, there's one essential question which you probably answered already, but I might have to just understand it a bit better. generally, is an isolated pawn something which you should avoid, or is it completely situational, or should you even go for it if you know all about it?
That is a good question. Usually, you're taught that it's one type of pawn weaknesses, and it is.
Yeah.
So it is a type of pawn weaknesses, like the double pawns are, like the backward pawns are, and isolated queen pawn in particular. This pawn structure that we're talking about, it. Like I said, it can be both. It can be a weakness and a strength.
Yeah.
Why it is a strength is because in some of these openings where you get it, the reason why you get it in the first place is because you have some other positional advantages in your favor. So there's always a reason. Just like the double pawns can also be a good thing. It can protect a lot of squares around you. It's the same thing with the isolated pawns. You have to see the benefits and the drawbacks of it, and then decide which one outweighs it for you in your case.
Excellent.
But usually I find that people don't even sort of consciously get them, and once you get there, you kind of have to play this position. Yeah, either from either of the sides.
Okay.
So
yes, thank you for clarifying. So now, what could be a good plan? I mean, the queen can go to b3, to c2. The bishop can go to e3, maybe. Oh, I have to adjust our board, our window quickly. Oh no, not again. You're switching back and forth. It doesn't matter. Okay. Wait a second. Okay. So yeah, you can get the queen. Well, actually, a b3 is actually not that good of a move. I mean, there's probably knight a5.
Right.
That's not so healthy. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with those positions. It's funny. So yeah, I would be already in a painful situation with white. I think bishop e3 looks.
Bishop e3.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit more passive than other moves that we usually make with the bishop. Yeah. So here, I understand why you're not so sure. And I completely understand it. So one of the typical plans that I've said in the very beginning, it can apply here. So you already know where some of them belong. Maybe some of the pieces can't go there yet. So for example, our battery is not really set up yet, and it can't be set up too well because of all the knight before threats right away if we play some queen d3 or some bishop d3. And so you can always, once you know where the pieces should go, you can always make a move for the piece that actually doesn't really have an option, and that would be the rook on e1, because you know that it's a useful move. You know the rook belongs there, and that is there's nothing wrong with this move right away, and it also includes some threats.
Don't know why I didn't see that.
So now black played the knight back to f6, and this was the first move that already looks strange to me, but I understand why black did it. So they wanted to avoid
taking the knight.
Taking the knight and actually getting a different type of pawn structure where both of these pawns are isolated, but they're not exactly on an open file, so it's different. Those positions are completely separate things, but let's say the black didn't want to get it. So here, this next move is quite important. And I do think it's quite a difficult one to find, but judging from all of the plans that I've named before that you want to carry out, is there a certain move that jumps out to you that maybe prepares the plan that you want to do, or what would you try to do in this position, and would it work?
I immediately have a plan. I immediately have a move. I'm looking at it the whole time, and I think it's really good. Now, for you at home, if you want to think a bit more, just do that, and then consider what you would play here. It is interesting to get some insights about what is good or bad. So I'm thinking about, and I know why you said it might be a bit illogically, but I think bishop g5 is strong.
Okay. So
Oh,
that's one of the moves. It's not the one, but it's one of the moves that I think is logical in this position. And it leads to approximate equality after just black continues to develop normally and white continues to develop normally. This is a position you
okay.
can totally play. It's equal, and it's fine. So the move that we do is surprisingly is the one that is better and takes over the initiative, even though it doesn't look like a move that would do that.
Okay, then I have to reconsider again. Now, what would be giving some initiative here?
Now, what is your general? What are your next plans for your pieces?
Well,
I
there
would
we
ask
go
that.
again. Not that much plans yet. Or I don't see a direct. My idea was bishop g5 to give more pressure on the bishop on e7 if I would
Mhm.
1 point push forward d5. Now I have my rook on e1. That was
Mhm.
the main idea. By the way, if you
Okay.
also have comments, what your ideas is, I like to read that. Every now and then somebody writes, in this position I had at move this and this, I had this idea. This is quite
Mhm.
interesting to look at. So,
Mhm.
what could be a good strategy or idea? I still want to. I would like to move my bishop, but maybe
Mhm.
f4 instead of g5.
Mhm. So it's not going to be any move with the bishop.
Mhm.
You were right in your thinking that you always have to consider d5. D5 is even possible here, but it wouldn't be too good because of knight a5.
Yeah,
Not sure if you noticed this one, but this is why d5 right away would
earlier
not be
already, exactly. Yeah.
would be a little too early and you would have to give up a pawn. I do think there's still compensation. It's still an interesting dynamic position, but d5, it wasn't really the right time. So one of the main plans that I've mentioned at first is to get the battery along this diagonal. So that would actually be our main plan.
So it is queen to c2.
It is not, well, it is not queen to c2. Like I said, there was a problem with placing the pieces on this diagonal,
Yeah,
and it
yeah,
was that the knight will go to b4,
exactly.
and it's standing well there, and there from there it can go back to d5 and have a good outpost.
Wow, why can't I? This is funny because I'm so unfamiliar with
So
this
that already
diagonal.
gives a big hint as to what the move is. Is if you don't want knight b4 to happen, you that's all you have to
So it is
stuff.
a3. Okay,
It
so
is a3, and
I.
surprisingly, this is the move that sort of gives white the initiative. And to some people who maybe play this opening or know this position, it's actually a theoretical move. So if you check,
Yeah,
it's
okay.
for many people, this is just theory and they play it, but I think it's a quite an instructive move, and it's a hard one to find if you've never seen it
Hmm.
before, because it just looks passive, and you know that in this position you have to play actively, but it's really not. So
I thought about it
now
one move earlier to be fair. Yeah, but yeah, that is interesting. Okay.
Now, black, of course, is going to try to develop this bishop, and likely they're going to do it on b7.
Hmm.
So now there is a threat of b5. Do you have an idea of how to deal with that threat?
Well, that looks even more. No, it cannot be a4.
It cannot be a4 because that looks positionally wrong to have moved
Yes.
a3 and then a4 next move, so it's not that.
Huh. Oh, is it? No, it can also not be. Well, I might want to attack the knight on c6 a little bit. So I thought about um, knight to e5, but then the whole main
Yeah, yeah,
lesson is kind of
the pawn is going to be gone.
yeah.
So b5 is inevitable, and what it's going to do is going to attack her bishop when it happens.
Yes,
So
we move
the
our
prophylaxis against it,
bishop to a2 or
it is
f1.
a2,
Yeah.
but we can move it away to b3 too. But in the game, a2 happened.
Hmm.
So from a2, the bishop
Oh.
is already aiming at that long diagonal. And b5, when it happens, it happened without the tempo on the bishop, which was pretty important considering the next sort of decisive
Oh,
move.
okay.
So next one you have to find. I know I'm making you guess at every move, but
That's
because that's
great.
the essence of this position is that every move matters. And that determines who's going to take over the initiative. So once again, you to move as white. Why did we have to do this prophylaxis against e5? And why did we want to have this extra move on this turn?
Well, I mean, I might be a bit too quick with this, but of course I can see that at one point the bishop can go to b1, the queen to c2, attack on h7 if the knight on f6 gets taken by the bishop, which is at the moment on c1. So this is one little tiny, very, very easy plan I have in mind. Is there some truth in this?
You really want to play bishop g5. I know it's a very
so
tempting move.
heavily. I don't know why. I always play that.
You
though,
know,
so-
I can tell you one problem with bishop g5. It's not like it's a problem, but it's a sort of a long-term problem that I can see.
because
It's
there's
the fact that you're not going to be able to play d5 that easily, because
Yeah.
then the knight will recapture and do the whole it's called a helicopter tactic, if you want to call it like that. You've never heard it before?
No.
It's when the knight goes to d5 or to d4, whatever it is, and comes back taking the other piece. So it does like a little turn.
Oh.
So
How funny. Okay.
so that's one of the issues here, is that you're probably never going to be able to play d5 too conveniently, because the knight can capture it, which attacks the bishop, and then your bishop will have to take and the knight will come back. But generally bishop g5 is a good developing move, nothing wrong.
Well, okay, so if we move there and now we can... What can we do now? What can we...
Why were we waiting for b5 to happen this whole
Yeah.
time?
Why were we? That's such a good question, and I don't know. Apologies for the people at home, because those who have played or are playing this opening all the time, they're just like, oh, come on. It's so clear. You have to know.
It's one of the
this.
main plans that I have named for white.
Well, okay, so what but why is this? I don't get it. So no, do you have? Let's continue the show, because I
Okay.
don't want it to take too long. I don't know.
The move is d5, which is the typical move that you want to play in this position at the right time. And right now is the right time, because this diagonal just got opened up. So we can have, after all of the captures, you can calculate that one of your pieces will be on that diagonal, and that will be a good tempo for us. So we capture with the knight. They took back. And well, I guess the question is you can ask yourself is, do you capture with the queen or with the bishop? And that actually makes a difference.
I see.
Big difference.
Well, for me, it looks more natural to take with the queen here.
It is the capture with the queen. So
at least one right.
Got it right. And the idea is that after b5 has been played, now we have this immediate attack on the c6 knight. And the whole tactic is that the queen exchange is not possible. Yeah. Because, do you see what happens in the end?
Yeah, at least that I can see.
Yeah. We end up winning the bishop on e7. So that's part of the tactic of why d5 was favorable, because this exchange now became not possible for black. So they had to play bishop b7, and this next move, queen h5. As you can see, the pieces kind of came to life, and this d5 pawn break helped us a lot. The bishop now has two diagonals to work on. There's that one, and it can also switch to b1 if it's necessary. Bishop g5 is always an idea. Now there's pressure on f7 and h7, and the other rook can come to d1, and it's going to be with a tempo attacking the queen. So the position sort of comes to life. Do you have, if you had to evaluate this position, what would you think is white's advantage here? Do you think white has an advantage at all?
I think it does. White has an advantage because with all those pieces having this long diagonals and all those spots in this very, very open field, white, in my opinion, has a stronger advantage. Yeah.
You're right about that. If you ask the engine, they would even go as far as to say that white is winning. I don't think it's that that clear
Maybe
when you
not,
have this
yeah.
position in an actual game. But it is true that it's a completely dominating position and that white is the one that has the threats faster. So yeah, surprisingly, it's something like +2 would be around the evaluation, but it is harder to figure it out. So now the next move is going to be your favorite move because it's bishop g5. You see that
Hallelujah.
the rook and the bishop are the only ones that are not working, so we get them back. I'm not sure if bishop b5 was the best move. It probably wasn't, but we're looking at a game.
Likes to play with fire here. So
it's and it still makes sense.
There's only one move. There's only one single move. Or,
only one move.
Rook to d8, but that is catastrophe. I think h6 is the only move, yeah.
Yeah, it is, because otherwise you can get mated on h7, or you can lose on f7. So there's some big threats right now. So h6 is the only move. And this next one is going to be, one of my, I think, favorite maneuvers.
Then because I'm looking at it, I don't see the winning situation yet, but maybe it has to be queen to g6, right?
Queen to g6, you're kind of close, because that's going to be the next move that shows up. It's not the one here.
So, okay. My fault. Yes, I understand. It has to be the rook lift to e3, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So then your queen g6 idea, you can keep it for later.
Yes.
And it gains even more power once the rook is on the third rank, because you might have realized that queen g6, you're going to want your rook there later anyway. So why not start with it? Exactly. So rook e3, like I also mentioned this to be one of the plans in the isolated queen pawn positions. Whenever you have the chance, that's usually a good way for the rook to join the attack. And I always feel really happy whenever I have a rook lift in my game.
True,
because it just feels kind of powerful.
It feels good, yeah.
And so this one was better than the other ones. Actually, probably I thought you would consider some capture, because that also makes sense. But I looked into it, and even though the computer says that white has an advantage, I think it's not that clear. Well, the advantage is going to be because of
we take, rook takes back, check on e8, king to h7.
Well, that's why the rook is probably not going to take back.
Oh, okay. But then we take this,
something like that.
Yeah, then we take the queen.
You get to some end game with rook and pawn against the bishop and knight, a nice material imbalance that we always talk about.
Buy the Fritz trainer if you haven't done so yet. Just sorry.
And it doesn't have a clear continuation, even though it looks good initially. So rook e3 was the best, like you said. Now knight a5 happened, and the next move is the only move that wins, and it is your brilliancy with queen g6. Notice that the bishop here is protecting that g6 square, and the queen from here is attacking h7. So after the capture, rook h3, there's no defense against the mate on h7. So I thought this game was instructive as to how to play with the pawn and what the general plans are. Pretty much all of the ones that I have said in the beginning, almost all of them got implemented here. So the takeaways from here is to watch what white did, and because it was a good way to activate his pieces. From black's side, black's position would have been much safer if he had kept his knight on d5, or kept one of the pieces on d5 to not allow this d5 pawn break. Black's big mistakes were playing some weakening moves like a6 and b5. So if you play this from the other side, also make sure to always consider this d5 pawn break. And after d5 was played, the position was already nearly lost, and it was extremely difficult to play. And so it's absolutely necessary for the defending side to make sure that this d5 pawn break doesn't arrive with tactical benefits for the opponent. So are you ready to see how to play from the other side of it?
Yes, please. Now we are switching the sides. Okay, there it is.
Not switching the colors, but we're switching the sides.
Okay.
Because we're going to be playing against the isolated queen pawn. And as you can tell, it's one of those endgames. I do think that those endgames you might be more familiar with than the openings if they're not your set of openings. But for this endgame, what would your evaluation be? It's obvious that white is better, so that's not even a question. But the question is white slightly better? Does black hold with the best defense? Do you think it's lost? Do you think you would win it? Do you think you wouldn't win it? As white, how would you really evaluate this position for yourself if you had it from the side playing against that pawn?
I love that's a very interesting task. I highly assume we are to move, right?
Yes. No, it's well, okay. They played rook d7.
Oh.
I mean, that changes things a bit because he can't defend the pawn.
Because I wanted to go to rook c7 and say like white will win. End of story. But that has just changed. Well, I would just say we have a slight advantage. Not much more. I don't see any absolute winning theory here. I guess we will power up our pieces to get this isolated pawn, but
do you have some move or some idea in mind?
So I learned today that a very good idea is to blockade d4 with the knight. So I would go to e2 and then d4 with my knight, double up the rooks on the c file.
Okay, that looks good. That sounds good. It's not what happened in the game, and you'll see what happened in the game. Generally, that's a good rule to know. Blockading the pawn can be a nice thing. It's more so an idea for the middle game, right? Because there you're trying not to prevent that pawn break. Here you actually don't mind not having this pawn blockaded, because right now it can't even, as long as the pawn can't do its pawn break, it's fine to not have it blockaded and instead have the knight somewhere like f4 so that it attacks it instead of blockading it and like blocking our pieces from attacking it. So it's fine not to have it blockaded as long as it can't advance. So you'll see that.
Yes,
you have another plan?
Yeah, I will tell you. But what will I see now?
What do you mean?
You just said you see.
I just said that you'll see as we go through this game that the side that has the isolated pawn in endgames like that is very, very limited to passive defense. And even if you think that it's slightly unpleasant, black is going to have to defend a bit. I think these positions are highly unpleasant, and most of the time, if you're playing against like someone who has the exact same time as you, if we exclude all the time situation and the end game skills are the same, I think you're going to win this as white like an overwhelming amount of times. Then the side is going to hold a draw.
Wow, now I'm really curious to know how to do this. So, okay, here's my second plan, because I realized that the other idea that you mentioned in the very beginning of the general strategies of what we can do is to double up the rooks on the d file, because our knight is already pointing there, and we have this pawn on e3 which can go to e4, and I think this is too much trouble to handle, and after all, I guess we will win this pawn.
So we are actually not going to win that pawn because
am I always wrong?
It's because you don't play these positions, so it's okay. Now you will know. So the point is that black is quite fortunate to have his d7 rook defended by the knight, right? Because he's going to bring the other rook to d8. We're going to play rook d1, and even if we ever do prepare e4, he is able to recapture it. because the
of
knight
defense. Okay.
is defending it. So it's not like there's this deadly pin that can never be dealt with, like it happens in, let's say, when there's 3 majors doubled up all on the same pile. So here, there's no immediate winning of the pawn, which actually makes it even more instructive of, even without winning the pawn, you can get a good dominating position. So I will reveal to you the actual move, which I think is a very good one, and it only makes sense when you see it. And the move that was played in the game, it's a game Wojtaszek was playing as white, he played g4. So the reason why this move is good is because it starts limiting black. Gaining space is never a bad idea if you don't create weaknesses for yourself, which you're fine with here in the end game. Your king is not in danger. And such a move, I think, like they show the mastery of these players of why they can win end games like these. And it seems like they do it very easily and flawlessly, but it's because of moves like these, you kind of narrow down black's margin for mistakes, right? Because he's already walking on the thin line, he's worse. So every mistake he makes is going to be more and more towards the losing the game side. So as long as you need to leave the less options possible, and gaining more space is one of those things that can provoke the opponent to make a mistake.
I have to ask you 2 questions, though, unfortunately.
Right,
So
sure.
we have to analyze one other thing, because maybe you can show me the solution, because I couldn't find it while calculating in my head. What happens after rook d1?
Yeah.
I guess they double up too. And then I play Okay, I already found my answer. e4 can be just taken with the pawn, not with the knight, as I thought all the time. Stupid. Okay, we got this out of our head. Excuse me. I hope you found it yourself at home. Now, after g4, what happens if you play g5 as an answer? Because I was looking, I thought about g4 too. And then I thought, like, if g5 looks very odd, of course, but it can be maybe answered like this.
My board froze for some reason.
Oh, no.
But g5, I think, is exactly what we like to see, because now there is a second weakness that we can attack, right? And so we're going to play knight e2. Then the knight can go, for example, to d4 into f5. I think f5 is a really annoying square for the knight, right? It's going to limit the king. It's going to have some tactical ideas.
Yes, okay.
And it's one of those moves that now gives more chances.
Okay, I got you. Okay, good. Thank you. That's, very important.
In the game, he played h6. And for the next little bit of this endgame, I will try to pass through the moves a bit quickly, but I want you to tell me where, because the moves all look very natural for both sides, so there's no reason to guess every single move, but I want you to stop me when you feel like black started to, like, things started to go wrong, and I wonder when that moment will look, what that moment will look like for you.
Okay.
So I'll go through the moves, and you can tell me when you think it happened, or if it hasn't, then it's fine.
So far, that looks very natural. Oh, is this we can take back? Yeah, now it's...
Okay. You go back and forth. I'm thinking, oh, this doesn't look fine, but then no, it's still fine.
Yeah, so far I think everything is still worse for black, but not like... Okay, wait a second. Yeah, but now I think black gets into trouble here.
Okay, that's a good moment. So all the way before that, black played their best, didn't create too many weaknesses. I know g5 looked like the first moment where you were thinking
for a
that
second,
maybe
but that
was wrong. But if you don't play it, then g5 will happen from our end. So g5 was pretty much necessary. And this knight from e2, it's the plan that I've showed earlier. You get to f5 eventually. You can try to do that. And this was the moment where it's might be the time trouble started, but it already looks like the margin for a mistake from black has narrowed down, and that you do something wrong and you can already be on the verge of losing this position because it got a bit tactical. But as you can tell, from the initial position to this position, there wasn't anything special that black did. There wasn't anything special that white did.
True.
And it's the reason why I said that these positions are very, very hard to defend, because no matter what you do, you can have the best defense ever and still have trouble defending it if the opponent, of course, doesn't do anything drastic. If, let's say, he just even plays normal moves. So that's why I think these endgames are very difficult to defend, and if you can avoid them, that is probably easier. So both sides could have played better, so I'll skip over a few tactics. And eventually they got to this point, still made a few improving moves. The knight might want to go to e6, but decided not to. And I think this is the next important moment. And yeah, this might be the next important moment. What should white do now about this rook trade that was offered?
Well, if we're trading rooks, I believe in a couple of moves. The knight can go to e6, the white knight, and that is a beautiful piece. But then I'm thinking about a little in-between move like g5.
So g5 is the best move, and that's what was played in the game. So the reason why immediate rook trade, so e6 is a very nice square. The rook can go there, would be good. The knight can go there. White is still better. But let's say you do end up doing something like that. So one thing you definitely don't want to do is, if you trade knights, you can already think maybe you've increased the drawing chances for the opponent, because rook endgames, we know, tend to be rather drawish. So the reason why I think this one loses the momentum a bit is because of this d4 move already. So maybe this pawn can even create some problems, run somewhere, and you didn't really make it difficult yet, although white is still slightly better, but it's not so decisive as g5, which creates a lot more problems. If black does nothing, g6 will destroy the position completely. So after takes, knight g5 was good. It's not what was played, but I think after something like this, white would be just in a very good shape to convert this into a win. It's not winning yet, but like I said, just very good chances for it with a pawn here. It looks very promising. Instead, he played king g4, which was actually a mistake, and it gave black one saving chance. And you might see it. It might look simple now. As black, would you go on the more offensive side with d4, and try to make that pawn your main asset, or would you go more on the defensive side and trade the knights with knight e5? What do you think would be the best defensive try in such cases?
That is such a good question.
So I give you the two options.
Yes. What do you at home think? Well, I think I have to go with d4, because it is just a bit more active, and I think this will be distract a bit from the other pieces. But then again, the knight is strong. But
that is what black did in the game and ended up losing. And I think it was one of the important moments. So the simpler and the more defensive approach is better. And we already know that rook endgames tend to be drawish. This one is quite difficult to evaluate, but once you get more used to playing these endgame positions, you can right away compare it to the previous one, the one with the knights, and realize that this is much more chances. So the king here looks scary, but the pawn on this pawn, which has been the object of discussion the whole time, can now be a pretty good asset. And even if white messes it up and let's say gets greedy with taking pawns, they cannot even lose after d3, and there's no way to prevent the pawn.
That is
But
tricky.
okay, it should be a draw. So the rook can obviously defend it, doesn't matter where it goes. But this type of position is a fairly easy draw.
Oof.
What happened was d4, and that kind of concludes the game a bit, because the pawn ends up being lost. So the pawn was prevented from promoting by the knight, and the pawn got lost with rook h3, and the poor pawn does not really have anything to do.
It's
so
so
the reason why it can't be defended like this is because of this fork.
Ouch.
And the reason why it cannot be defended like this is this check once again, and then we take the rook and take the knight. So both ways of defending the pawn did not work out, and d2 got met with rook d3, and white won this endgame. So this one was a way to show how to play these endgames and why they're considered so unpleasant to play when you have the isolated pawn. And here was the plan of the method of how to play against it. So if I could summarize it in maybe 3 steps, it would be: first, you create the attack on that weak pawn. So you make sure that the opponent's pieces are tied to it. So that prevents the counterplay. Second step, after you have attacked the pawn and immobilized the opponent's pieces, then you can gain space somewhere. Gain space in order to just improve the position of your pieces on either side of the board, whatever is the case. King side is sometimes a good target because you have kind of that extra pawn there. And third, final step is you need a second target of your attack, because you all know the principle of the 2 weaknesses. And once you get the second target, the attack really gets a lot more clear and a lot harder to defend against. So in this case, the second target was that we created a pass pawn on the king side. And that decided the game, because now black's pieces had to worry about both of these and the weakness on d5. So those were kind of the steps, and I think they can be followed in a lot of such cases where you're slightly better, or you have this one weakness and you just need a second one to win it. So that was one game that showed how to play against the isolated pawn and why it can be considered a weakness. And the first game showed why it can be a strength.
Awesome. A very valuable lesson, as always. You can unshare the screen. We are at the end of our show. Svitlana showed us some smart moves once again. Thanks all of you for watching, being so loyal for the shows, enjoying it as much as we do making them. And I would say we see each other again soon. Have a great evening, day, whatever it is. Bye-bye.